I am very pleased to be able to speak with you, Colonel Kirk. And this in particular is important as we are interviewing Vietnam veterans in a commemoration for National Vietnam War Veterans Day, which is on March 29th. So thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us today.
It's a pleasure being with you.
Now, sir, you spent 38 years in the Air Force, a big chunk of your professional life. When did you know that you first wanted to fly?
Well, the answer behind that is that I was an only child. My mother wanted me to be a doctor all my life, and I was a very good musician, which is significant in that all during high school, I got to play with name bands. It was during the World War II, and during the Big War, I was 16 years old, and I was away from home at night a lot of the time while I was in high school. And when time came to go to college, my dad and I discussed that maybe I needed a little discipline. So instead of going to the University of Virginia, I went to Virginia Military Institute. And it was studied pre-med. I was actually accepted at Medical College of Virginia. And in the summer after I graduated from VMI, I stopped one day right in the middle of the street and stamped my foot, and I said, "This is BS. I don't want to be a doctor. I never wanted to be a doctor. What do I do now?" So I called my colonel back at VMI and said, "Can I still take that commission and go in the Air Force?" And he said, "Yes, but you'll have to fly. You'll have to go to pilot training." And I had never had a ride in an airplane. Nobody in my family had ever had a ride in an airplane. And I thought, well, I don't know. It's okay with me. I'll try. So I accepted my commission and went to Randolph Field in San Antonio, Texas, and began the year-long pilot training thing. Received my wings a year later. And to tell you the truth, it was about 3 months into pilot training before I decided I liked it. It was hot on the ground, cold in the air, and an instructor in the back seat of this propeller-driven airplane was screaming at me every moment we went in the air that I couldn't seem to get anything right. I was dumb, which is a typical thing for instruction. Anyway, there were 38 of us. I finished number 2 in the class and I went to fly the B-25, which was a very light bomber that bombed Tokyo in 1942 with General Doolittle. And that was in flying school, we flew that. And coming out, I wanted to fly the P-51, which was the primary fighter in World War II. And instead of getting the P-51, my entire class was railroaded into B-29s, the big bomber that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And the reason was that the Korean War was going on then. This was 1951. The Korean War was going on. They were recalling a lot of crews from World War II, but they didn't have many young co-pilots. So they took my entire class of 38 people, I believe it was, and sent every one of us to the B-29s. And I flew that airplane for a year and a half and was so miserable. I went to my squadron commander and said, "Sir, please help me get out of these big airplanes. I don't want anything to do with big airplanes." He helped me. I went to Korea in a propeller-driven airplane, the same airplane that I had flown in basic flying school. I called it AT-6. And my job in Korea was to have an Army artillery observer in the back seat of my airplane. And we had about a 10-mile wide section of the front into about 5 miles into enemy territory. And each day we would go up, the 2 of us, and fly low over that area and find out targets. And when dive bombers, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines would come in, I would go and mark targets with smoke rockets, and they would come in and dive bomb. And then I would go in and look for damage and see what damage they'd done and give them a report, and then try to survive and get back out of there. And that's what I did for 50 missions. And included in that, I was on the front lines with the 7th Infantry Division for 3 months as a forward air controller before the war was over.
So you flew those 50 missions in Korea, and then a decade later you were in Vietnam. Do you recall when you
Yeah.
first heard about Vietnam and its potential as another battleground between the U.S. and communism?
Yes, absolutely. At that particular time, I was stationed in Japan, in northern Japan. I had been there about a year. I went over in 1965, and in by 66, the war was getting pretty intense in South Vietnam. And I felt then, as I feel now, if you're a professional military officer and pilot, that there's a war on, you ought to be there. So I was volunteering during the year 65 and 66 for anything and just about everything to get into the war, and they would not let me go. So during, I guess it was about September of 1966, I took a 2 weeks leave, which is 2 weeks time off, and bummed a ride to Vietnam on a military airplane. And I was able to get 25 missions, combat missions, on leave. And so at least I knew that I wasn't going to miss the war. And then I went back to my job in Japan and was very happy that at least I was not going to miss the war. And then about 4 months later, in January of 1967, I was selected for the F-105, which was a principal Air Force fighter bomber, dive bomber, if you will, in the entire Vietnam War. It was the workhorse of the whole war.
So it seems pretty incredible then that you first flew your first combat missions in Vietnam while you were on leave. You must have been a very
Yes.
you must have been a very convincing person to show up and then all of a sudden be flying missions.
Well, it turns out that I knew the boss of the base, and I called him and says, if I get down there, would you let me fly some missions? And he says, yes. And he didn't realize I was going to fly. Sometimes I flew 3 times a day in order to try to get those missions as quickly as I could, because I knew I had to go back home in 2 weeks.
Well, that's incredible. You have many, I think, incredible parts to your story. Another is that that fateful day of October 28, 1967, when in really a span of a few hours, you went from flying your Thunder Chief fighter bomber in the biggest air operation of the war to that point, successfully bombing your target, being hit by enemy fire, making a run for safety and not quite making it, being injured when bailing out of your airplane, being beaten when you were on the ground by civilians, and then ending up in a prisoner of war camp. How did you process all that on that day?
That's a really interesting question, and it's probably one of the most important things in my life. At the time, I mentioned the F-105 was the workhorse of the war, and you mentioned the raid. I was leading the biggest raid of the war to that date. We formed the 2 bases that were flying that airplane in Vietnam to make this big raid on one of the most important railroad and highway bridges in North Vietnam. And as we made the bomb run, I was hit with anti-aircraft fire, and I was set on fire. And I knew that I had to drop my tanks, my external fuel tanks, and I knew that I wasn't going to get home, that I would have to eject, but my goal was to try to get about 50 miles south so that when I bailed out of the airplane, that I had the likelihood that helicopters and other airplanes could come in and they could get me out. But it didn't make it. The fire was so intense that about 27 miles from the city of Hanoi, the flight controls, which were all hydraulic, burned through. My airplane nose dove straight for the ground, and I had to eject. I ejected and went out around 600 miles an hour and was knocked unconscious and landed in the parachute unconscious. When I came to, there was a group of Vietnamese men, women, and children clustered around me. They were kicking me, spitting on me, beat me with sticks, throwing rocks at me, and they beat me black and blue. And I think they would have killed me in 5 minutes, but I heard shots being fired, and the people backed away, and the military came right up and took me prisoner. And I went into the prison camp where I was very badly injured, and kept for 2 days, blindfolded and bound and gagged in a stretcher, and then put me through a interrogation session, which I refused to talk. And then they tortured me. I was tortured very badly for about 3 days. And then by the way, I broke. I was beyond anything I could do anymore. And when I gave them something, but I have no idea to this day what I gave them. But they then, for the first time, put me in a cell by myself. And what you mentioned about the reaction or the impact on me was the worst thing of my life to that date and today. And you can picture, I was a young 38-year-old lieutenant colonel, squadron commander, doing what I'd been trained to do for 17 years, leading my squadron in that big raid. All of a sudden, I'm shot down. I'm very badly injured. I'm captured, and I couldn't walk for 2 months because of my legs for hitting in the parachute. And being very badly injured, I got out of the airplane. No one saw me, so I knew my family didn't know if I was alive or dead. I was captured. I failed my country and given them something, and it was the best. I never knew if or when I would ever come home. It was the absolute rock bottom period of my life, and as honest as I can be, I really wanted to die. And they put me in a cell by myself. I had not seen another American yet. And about 10 or 15 days went by, and it seems to me that every 5 minutes I would stop and say, why me, God? What did I do to deserve this? Could I have done something different with the airplane? I wouldn't have been hit. Could I have done more under torture? What will happen to us? Everything bad you can think about was all coming together in me at that time. And it went on like that for several days. And I was very dejected and down, the worst period of my life. And then one morning, I sort of slammed my foot on the ground, and I said, dear God, help me. I've got to dig deep. I've got to pull myself together and recognize if I try with all my might and heart and I have God's help, I can survive this. I will live. I will be here a long time, perhaps, but I will go home someday. And truly, from that day, I kind of came out of, it was almost total isolation into the world again. And the near 6 years in the camp was not really that bad after I came to that epiphany, if you will, and was able to endure what they threw at me.
One of the things that strikes me is throughout your career and even your first combat flights in Vietnam, which you sought out while on leave, is you're a gentleman who seems like you need to be in the action and doing different things, and then you end up in this POW camp where you couldn't exercise, you had nothing to read. I mean, that must have been incredibly difficult just in itself, the lack of activity.
The prison camp was very difficult, and the most important thing in the prison camp was the realization that life was passing you by, starting at 38 and coming home at 43. Boy, that's 5, almost 6 years of the best period of your life. And there I sit with nothing to read, nothing to write. I was initially alone. Then after the torture session, they put me in a cell with 3 Navy guys, 4 of us in the same cell for 14 months. And then I had an altercation with the guard, and I was broken out and put in solitary confinement for 2 years. I never saw another American for 2 years, was never allowed out of the prison camp. I mean, never allowed out of the cell, except to go outside for about 10 minutes a day and dump my toilet bucket and spread a little water on my face and so forth. And then after 2 years in solitary, on Christmas of 1970, there had been a raid by the American forces called the Sante raid, where they went into a prison camp with helicopters and Army Special Forces in October of 1970 to actually bring some prisoners out. But all the prisoners had been removed from this POW camp about 2 weeks before the raid. But we feel that the Vietnamese was very concerned that we would do it again. So they closed 6 outlying prison camps outside in the jungle around Hanoi and brought everyone in to the big, massive federal, like a federal penitentiary, the Wallow prison in Hanoi, and put us all in 7 big cells. And I was coming out of solitary confinement, and on Christmas night, I was put in a big cell with 47 other Americans, first I'd seen in 2 years. And it was so good, it was almost like coming home.
It seems to me that as a pilot, it's a very individual thing. You're in the airplane and you're really 100% reliant on yourself. And even
Yes.
even in much of your time in the POW camp, you were in isolation. But it seems to me that the camaraderie that you could develop with the other prisoners was a very important part of all of you being able to survive that experience.
I think you're absolutely right. During the bulk of the prison time, we were all in 1, 2, 3, or 4-man cells and in cell blocks. We were never allowed out. We were never allowed to talk to anyone outside of your cell. And we devised a system called the tap code, where we tapped through the walls with a code, and we were able to get everybody's name and literally spend hours just in conversation between the walls. And we had all the names. We had a structure in the prison camp. We had the leadership down, and there were rules that we set up for the people in the prison camp. And there was enough communication. And as new people came in, they brought the news of what was happening in the United States because we weren't getting any news.
And so I want to go back to something you mentioned a little while ago when you were put in a cell with these 3 Navy pilots. It turned out you had met 2 of them not that long ago.
Yes, there was a procedure. We maintained an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel who was flying either the F-4 Phantom or the F-105, would go out and stay about 21 days on the aircraft carrier in the Tonkin Gulf and be a liaison with the Navy Admiral commanding all the naval forces in the area. And I was out there for 21 days, and I actually got 2 missions in the back seat off the aircraft carrier while I was there. And I went around. There were 4 different squadrons on the boat when I was there, 2 attack squadrons, dive bombing squadrons, and 2 squadrons that were air-to-air combat. And I briefed all the squadrons on what we were doing and so forth. And at the end of my 21 days, I went back home to Thailand, my base in Thailand. And 7 days later, I was shot down. And lo and behold, after about 28 days, I think it was, of isolation, I was put in a cell with these 3 Navy guys. One of them had been there already by about a little more than 6 months longer than I had. But the other 2 had been assigned to the Carl C, which was the ship I was on. And one of them was actually the squadron commander that had flown me on one of the missions. And the other one was in the A4, an attack airplane that I had briefed and remembered very well from the days I was on the ship. What an odd coincidence, but that's what happened.
That is incredible. Do you remember, after about 5.5 years in captivity, do you remember the feeling you had when you all really started to think or perhaps even know that your captivity was going to be coming to an end?
The answer to that is I would say mixed. Everybody was thrilled once we actually learned, but we didn't know because the peace talks in Paris went on for about 3 or 4 years before the end of the war. And every time they gave us a banana, we thought maybe the war was going to end. But what happened, I think most people up there steeled themselves into the belief that we would be there a long time, a lot longer than we were. And we felt, I believe, certain the first time was around the 12th of December, if I remember correctly, of 1972, when they brought the B-52s, the big intercontinental bombers, to Hanoi for the first time, and they also blockaded the harbor of Haiphong, which was their only major harbor, we all felt that the war would end very soon. And when the bombs started falling right around us and the ceiling was falling in the cells, we knew they were getting close and they were bombing in Hanoi. And we were all convinced the war would end very soon. And it did on the 23rd of January of 1973. And the camp commander told us the next day. And he said, the war is over. And if all goes well, you will be going home soon. And that's all they told us. But they actually split us up into 4 different groups, depending upon how long you'd been up there. The people that had been up there the longest period of time came home first. The next week, the next group was released, and so forth, over a 4-week period.
Well, that must have been an amazing feeling. I listened to one of your other interviews where you talked about how the plane that you were loaded aboard was silent until you all felt the wheels finally come off the ground and you were in the air.
That's exactly right. If you picture, they brought the buses in on the morning we were released for each group, brought the buses in, we loaded up on the buses. We went out across the Tom Kirk Memorial Bridge, as I call it, the bridge that I'd knocked down. And as we were on the bridge, we look up and there comes this big, beautiful American transport coming in the land to take us home. And everybody on that bus was crying like babies. Anyway, we got into the airfield and they stopped and parked behind a hangar. We couldn't see anything. And we sat there for several hours. And we all felt, oh my God, something's gone wrong. We're going back. Anyway, they finally took us off, lined us up in columns of 2. And turns out I was directly behind, on the left file, directly behind John McCain, who was in my cell for a while. And we marched out and we were officially turned over to a Vietnamese colonel or general, I don't know, an American general. We saluted, we were turned over, we were escorted out to the airplane, and people just sort of stood around and talked until the airplane fired up, closed the doors, and we taxied out to the runway. It was just quiet. We were talking, but no real excitement. And it was still there. They had a grip on us. We felt maybe something will go wrong, we'll go back. And once the airplane was actually in the air, it was bedlam. Hell broke loose. Everybody was screaming and hugging each other and so forth. And as you know, we went to Clark Field in the Philippines.
Well, that had to have been a very amazing feeling. Now you came home, you recovered. I think I heard you mention in another interview that you at one point had lost 90 pounds in the prison camp. So you came home, you recovered from that incredibly stressful experience, and you immediately wanted to go back to flying duty. Was any part of that transition from POW back to flying duty, was any of that difficult, or you just wanted to get right back at it?
I wanted to get right back at it, but you have to understand, everyone in the North Vietnamese prison camp everyone up there was an officer, was a pilot. Most of us had college educations, and we were very down in the early days, all of us. But you become more used to and accepting of your plight. You couldn't fight it. The only we could do is sit there and make life as good as we could. And when we came home, the last 6 months of the war, they gave us more potatoes, more milk, powdered milk, more bread to fatten us up. I actually gained 50 pounds in the last 6 months in the camp. I came home weighing 152, and I was down about 95 pounds in the camp itself, because all we had was a bowl of soup in the morning, a bowl of soup in the afternoon, a little piece of bread. And you don't maintain weight that way. But getting out, when we got to the Philippines, into Clark Field, we were isolated for 3 days because they didn't know what diseases we had. They didn't know what kind of condition we were in and so forth. But they took us in and immediately, middle of the night and all, gave us complete physical exams. They had flown in optometrists, they had flown in dentists, and we had some temporary false teeth fixed for people that need them. Everybody that needed glasses got glasses. They had tailors there that prepared new uniforms with all our medals and everything. And the first thing once they did in the hospital was take us to the dining hall, and we could have just about anything we wanted to eat. And life was pretty good. And then we had unlimited phone calls anywhere in the world to your family or wherever you wanted to call. And then after 3 days, we got on airplanes and flew back to the United States. And telling you to tell the truth, it took no time to get right back into our normal life. And it wasn't like we were children. We were definitely men and that understood what we'd been through. And we were most of them that I know of, unless you're very badly injured, stayed on active duty and went right back to flying or whatever.
Well, I think that says a lot about the dedication to service that so many of our Vietnam veterans have. Do you and your fellow POWs, were you able to maintain contact with them over the years?
Yes, I say that especially in the beginning, we had a POW reunion just about every 2 years for a great number of years, and now it's maybe every 2 or 3 years, but we don't get the attendance like we used to do. You have to realize we have been home 45 years, and in reality, if you were not with a smaller group of people in the camp, you have and will have always a bond of fellow POWs and shared experiences. But I don't have a lot in common with a fellow that was a lieutenant in the camp, and I was a lieutenant colonel, but there were 28 of us who were Navy commanders or Air Force and Marine lieutenant colonels. Most of us kept in contact pretty well after the war and remained good friends. And we knew through reunions most of the people. But in honesty, I only had seen 47 people when I came home after 6 years. And so they kept us pretty well isolated. And the 47 were in that big cell I told you about where I was moved on Christmas night.
Now, after your military career ended, and I know you went on to a very successful career in the business and investment world, how often did you think back on your military service? Every day?
Just about every day. I say that in the sense of not dwelling on it, but there's nothing in the world as wonderful to me as total freedom. And I can't make it strong enough that when you are locked up and your life is taken away from you, it's a tremendously difficult thing to come to grips with. And obviously, I have a slogan: every day above ground is a good day. And I don't have any sour moments. The prison experience was something that one of my cellmates said at one time: if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined up. Well, it was a pretty serious joke, but nonetheless, I can tell you in all honesty, I'm a better person, a better father, a better husband, a better citizen, having been there, because I can today really understand the difference between the ants and the elephants in life, what's important, what's not important. And I don't know if you know, but I'm 92 years old and still in pretty good health. And I just pray to God every day for my blessings. And as my dad told me one time, he says, "You're the most blessed man I know." And I agree with him.
Well, I know that you've spent a lot of time in recent years speaking to young people and other groups about your experience in the military. It seems as if the most important lesson that you try to pass along to others is this idea that each of us can learn and become stronger no matter how difficult the experience. Is that right?
Absolutely right. That's interesting that you should have seen that somewhere. There's no question that adverse conditions, bad situations when you survive, come along and build another strength, a part of you that perhaps without that you wouldn't have had, be it money problems, be it physical problems, family problems, or whatever. If you can attack them and see through short-term problems or short-term happenings and look at the big picture, we can, all of us can just about endure anything and come back. One of the things that I've been somewhat successful in doing, I've helped a number of ladies who lost their husbands. And I've talked to them. I love to do it because my idea is God put us on this earth for only a few years, a pitifully small amount of time in the big scheme of things. And there's only one life. And if you lose your husband or a child or whatever, you don't lose your life. You will never lose their love. You'll never lose the association you had in the past. But God gives us the strength and the ability to pick up our lives, accept that, and carry on. And that's exactly what every one of us in the prison camp had to do. We had to deal with harshness and reality, live with it, make the best of it, and come out better people. And I think that's a very important message to children, to families, or people who've lost loved ones, because we should pick up and live our life to the fullest, because we're really not here very long.
Well, Colonel Kirk, thank you so much. I think that's a perfect way to end our conversation today. I truly appreciate meeting you, and I appreciate your time and your honesty. And on behalf of the fellow citizens in Arizona, I just want to say thank you for your service. Welcome home as a Vietnam veteran. We truly appreciate you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure talking with you. Hope I'll see you again soon.
Thank you, sir. You take care.